Peace, peace, peace. I am Phillip Roundtree, and you are tuned into the January 19th edition of Rhetorically Speaking. Shout out to those of you tuned in on IG Live. Props to those tuned in on Facebook Live and YouTube Live who were watching Umar, and I believe he might have just been, you might have just seen his just his expressions because there might not have been any volume because I don't see this moving. So I'm gonna try to get that to try and play that again for y'all because I know I make a lot of jokes about Umar here on Rhetorically Speaking, but his his perspective on black mental health, especially when it comes to black boys and black men, is so profound and is so necessary. And in that clip, he was discussing the root of psychology, especially here in America, something that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I'm gonna spend a couple seconds trying to figure out why that didn't play. Hopefully, it was just an error on my part. And let me know in the chat if you are tuned in whether it did. You could hear the volume or not. So I'm gonna try that again right now. Yeah, it doesn't look like it is. All right, I'm gonna get that situated at some point. So today I wanted to have a conversation on the American Psychiatric Association, their apology yesterday on Martin Luther King Day. So, and I'm going to bring up the apology. If you're not familiar with the American Psychiatric Association, they are the organization who who developed the Bible, the mental health Bible. And so that is the DSM now 5, right? And so when we're talking about mental health clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals, all the information that we get and that we use for diagnosing, that we use to develop treatment plans around, all comes from the American Psychiatric Association's DSM 5. It outlines diagnoses, it outlines symptoms, and it outlines just a slew of other information pertinent to mental health. Hence the reason why we call it the mental health Bible. The APA was formed on October 16th, 1844. So we're talking about, listen, some centuries ago, right? And only yesterday, on January 18th, 2021, Martin Luther King Day, did they come out and apologize for their role in perpetuating white supremacy. They apologized for terrorizing black folks psychologically, physically, and emotionally. I'm going to bring up their apology, and I'm not going to read it word for word. Again, if you're interested in seeing what a half-ass apology looks like, if you're interested in seeing what a hollow apology looks like, if you're interested in seeing what an ill-timed apology looks like, feel free to go to APA. I believe it's APA Psychiatry on Instagram, or you can go to their website to see what several pages of bullshit looks like. Excuse my language, I meant to say that. So I'm going to bring up the apology now, right? And like I said, I'm gonna go over it a little bit. So it says that APA's apology to black, indigenous people of color for its support of structural racism in psychiatry. And so the oldest national physician association in the country is taking an important step in addressing racism in psychiatry. They're beginning the process of making amends for both the direct and indirect acts of racism in psychiatry. The Board of Trustees apologizes to its members, patients, their families, and the public for enabling discriminatory and prejudicial actions within the APA and racist practices in psychiatric treatment for black, indigenous, and people of color. The APA is committed to identifying, understanding, and rectifying our past injustices, as well as developing anti-racist policies that promote equality and mental health for all. That's page 1. Page 2, they talk about early psychiatric practices laying the groundwork. And so I'm going to talk about that, right? Because in an apology, and we know when you are offering an apology to someone, you have to admit what it is that you did wrong. So we're not going to use jargon when we're apologizing. We want to be clear, we want to be concise, and we want to be direct. Something that they were not. So when we talk about an association that's been around since 1844, when they say structural racism, what they're talking about is this idea that African Americans were biologically inferior. They're talking about Samuel Cartwright, who was a psychiatrist, who argued that slavery was their natural state because they benefited from the hard work and were incapable of looking after themselves outside of the system. In 1851, Cartwright published a report where he invented two psychiatric disorders to explain the tendencies of enslaved people to run away or to resist hard work as mental illness. This is what they aren't saying, right? He said that enslaved people demonstrated childlike simplicity and lack of complex emotional processes, which were characteristics of their entire race. Hospital superintendents took that information, right? Because I'm going to, listen, I'm not going to give you a history lesson. I'm definitely going to bring it present. Hospital individuals, superintendents, took that information and used it to segregate black folk in hospitals, in substandard facilities, and putting them to work in the laundry, kitchen, and fields. Again, behind these practices is the idea that black people were somehow less than human, that they didn't feel the same way that white folk did and do, and that they weren't suitable for psychoanalysis or group therapy. In 1970, and again, now think about this. I said, when were they created? 1844, the APA. 1970 is when psychiatrist, I'm not sure which one he is, Jonathan Metzl, produced research that said, listen, the underpinnings of previous psychiatrists was problematic, right? And how, in order to atone for it, or to find a different way, because we know the civil rights movement also addressed mental health in various capacities. This idea of segregation. And so now what they started to do, they started to add words like aggressive. Think about how they define black folk these days, right? Aggressive. And there's such irony in the term aggressive, and I'll get to that later with my experience of the head of the APA, Arthur Evans Jr., who once told a young budding social worker by the name of Phil Roundtree that his approach, although he had amazing information when it comes to advocacy, was too aggressive for people. Think about the terminology, right? And so by adding the word aggressive to the definition of schizophrenia and marketing pharmaceuticals directly at black patients who they felt were more out of control, this truly began the over-pathologizing of black folk in mental health. And so when we talk about over-pathologizing, for those of you who do not know, what it simply means is the idea that every single solitary behavior has a root, and it's rooted in mental health. So if I'm sad, I have depression. I have clinically diagnosable depression. Instead of it just being sadness, an experience that every other individual in this world experiences. And we see this often with our black boys and our black girls and our black persons, our children and adolescents, where when they don't subscribe to the behavioral expectations within the classroom, they're usually referred for mental health treatment. And like Dr. Umar always says, if you want a diagnosis, you can get a diagnosis. All you have to do is say, I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z. Because there's no scientific proof when it comes to mental health diagnosis. What you have are a group of quote-unquote experts who sit and determine what symptoms are relevant for which diagnosis, what the prevalence needs to be, what the frequency needs to be, what the duration needs to be. Hence the reason why if you're experiencing prolonged sadness for several weeks, you can get a diagnosis of adjustment disorder, which is situational depression for the layperson. And so again, the APA controls all of this, right? We talk about their apology and how it was hollow. Let me get to page 3. Events in 2020 have clearly highlighted the need for action by the APA to reverse the persistent tone of privilege built upon the inhumanity of past events. Listen, cognitively, I understand exactly what you're saying. But it's not the individual who has the cognitive wherewithal who's receiving these diagnoses. I mean, it is. But a majority of the individual who are receiving these diagnoses are often disenfranchised. They're marginalized within the medical field. It's so interesting that the over-pathologizing of mental health takes place, yet there's still a minimizing of the experiences of black and brown folk. And so here we have again the APA offering an apology. We commit to working together with members and patients in order to achieve the social equality, health equality, and fairness that all human beings deserve. We hope this apology will be a turning point as we strive to make the future of psychiatry more equitable for all. Events in 2020 caused this. Events of 2020. The good brother Rashawn Miller said, why now? We know exactly why now. This is the perfect time for white tears. This is a perfect time for mea culpas from white folk. Their 4 pages equates to a, yo, my bad, we was on some bullshit. A my bad. And we're talking about going back to 1844. How many generations of black and brown folk have been impacted by the APA? Not only the information within the DSM, but also the practice of it. We know there's a lack of representation in mental health. 3% of the world's of the country's psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals are African American. And so when we talk about something that is rooted in white supremacy, no different than prisons, which the APA has had a hand in filling the prisons. And I encourage you to go watch the Dr. Umar Nick Cannon class, where he goes into detail about how Ritalin, which is a drug prescribed disproportionately to black boys, is one molecule away from cocaine. And so here, and we know that the APA receives some of their funding from these drug companies. I've watched firsthand as a clinician drug companies come in and do a sales pitch on their newest medication. And it behooves the psychiatrist to take them up on it. Why? Because they can get some kickback. They get money, they get funding, as well as a nice brunch. The sales rep, they cash out. And so everybody wins except who? The black and brown little boy or girl or person who has no say in whether they desire to take the medication or not. Dr. Umar articulates how adults have the ability to speak to what the symptoms are. Listen, I'm fatigued, lack of appetite. My virility has dissipated. As opposed to a child who might sleep in class, who's a zombie, or whose only way to communicate what it is that their experiences is, I just don't like it. I hate it. If they say anything at all. Why? Because they're conditioned to do exactly what adults tell them to do. The APA is complicit of this. See, this is what they're not stating in their apology. It's just, yo, my bad for that ish that happened a little bit ago. You know what I'm talking about? And so for me to see that, it's frustrating. It's disheartening. And for it to take place on Martin Luther King's, the day we celebrate his legacy. Not the legacy that liberal white folk, the we shall overcome, the I have a dream, Dr. King. But we're talking about the entire person of Dr. King. He, like Kobe Bryant, like Malcolm, like Sam Cooke, their legacies are always complex. Why? Because they're human beings. And so to come out on a day that we're celebrating a black man who, as Mark Lamont Hill says, was a victim of state-sanctioned killing, and to center yourself, your white tears, and say my bad. And again, Arthur Evans is a black man at the head of the APA. But he's perpetuating these white supremacist ideals. And so he's a figurehead. Right? He's a colonized black folk. He's the overseer of the plantation. Because he has to keep the money rolling in. And so for them to center themselves on Martin Luther King, the day we celebrate his legacy, was disgusting. Who was the person in the room that said, listen, let's wait another day? They done killed that black man some 60 some odd years ago. I don't necessarily know if we need to be letting them know right now that we fucked up. Especially if it's going to be insincere, if we're not going to really get into the root of the issue. And so well, first I went over to their Instagram page, and I don't know the intern, and because we know that Arthur's not running that. They got some young student who's in the know with the gram posting this. And so I sit and read the comments to see if anybody was viewing it as I come across a white woman who does white woman things and says, well, what about women? Because white women always got to center themselves in the conversation. Because nobody else's experience matter. As their second in command, as they also perpetuate the white supremacy of their male counterpart. She says, what about women in our apology? And of course, you know how I am. I'm going to push back. Right? And say, this is exactly what the issue is in society as a whole. It's the reason why the APA feels comfortable in putting out this statement on MLK Day. It's also the reason why you go to the Capitol for your insurrection, Revenge of the White Folk, and don't turn your Wi-Fi off. Because you're oblivious. You're so used to being the center of attention. You're so used to of not having experiences. Can't forget that she meditates too, right? Yeah, because I said she has to center herself. And she said, I meditate. Oh, my white woman. But again, you're so used to being the center of attention that you can't think about outcomes. You can't think of other experiences. You're blinded by your whiteness. Let me get to what number 4 says. These appalling past actions, appalling. Okay, they done dropped that's not a GRE word. They hit us with a SAT word. As well as their harmful effects are ingrained in the structure of psychiatric practice. The APA recognizes that this inaction has contributed to perpetuation of structural racism that has adversely impacted not just its own BIPOC members, but also psychiatric patients across America. And so my question is, let's say I bought into this apology. Now what? What happens next? And so as I'm taking my notes, and shout out to the woman, right? Because that information that I was reading earlier about Cartwright, I think it actually came from a white woman on the NAMI website. I just say it better than her, right? They steal our shit, I steal her shit. But I'm sitting there I'm sitting there in preparation for this. And I say, let me go to Twitter and see what's happening with the APA. In the first week of February, they have a panel of non-white medical doctors having a conversation about racism in mental health. And I sat and I looked at it. Again, when we talk about what's your plan, that's not a salient plan. You might be thinking, Phil, why? Because they have non-white folk discussing racism. It's not our job. to sit and have these discussions about what these because are doing. You need these white medical doctors sitting there answering questions from the community. It's not our job to sit and answer while white folk are wilding at the Capitol. And that's why I salute D'Angelo Russell of the Minnesota Timberwolves when reporters asked him what were his thoughts about the insurrection. And he's like, that ain't, I stay out white folk, but that's white folk business. What you think? And so by having black folks sit and explain why white folk for the last couple centuries have behaved the way that they did is disgusting. Also, to have it be a panel full of medical doctors, right? And we understand that psychiatrists are indeed medical doctors. But the APA is the Bible for psychologists as well, for licensed clinical social workers as well, for licensed professional counselors as well. Again, when we talk about what are you doing to make good on these past mistakes, having black folk and an Asian woman explain racism is never it. Right? And so I sit and I think about what this means for a community in the future. And this is why it's incumbent upon black clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health professionals, National Association of Black Psychologists, the National Association of Black Social Workers, to really dig in deep in what we're now trying to do and what I feel is necessary in abolishing the APA, right? Because if we could talk about abolishing the police, because again, the foundation is corroded and rooted in white supremacy. And here we have the APA acknowledging it, but stating we're going to put Band-Aids over the warts. No, we might need to go see Dr. Pimple Popper and get her to squeeze out the lipoma, the cyst that is in the foundation of the APA. And so, yeah, I was thoroughly disgusted. I was going to have a conversation about Revenge of the White Folk 2, which is this being Inauguration Eve, but I'm not interested in that. Listen, I stay out white folk business. Now, I will come back tomorrow with my popcorn and discuss what I observed, because I'm hoping it's funny. I'm not trying to hear Joe Biden talk about unity. We long past that. That's over. There's no such thing as unity. We tried the unity thing, and our faces were spat in. We were beat with batons. Right? The National Guard was on standby. They stood back and stood by during our protest when black folk were murdered by the police. Nah, I ain't trying to hear about unity. I'm cool on that. So listen, man, I spent the 30 some odd minutes. I wish I had that Umar to play for you. But it just might. Matter of fact, let me see if I could do it this way, because it is so profound Then I'm going to try to bring it up again. Yeah, it ain't working. All right, well, listen, man. I appreciate you all for tuning in. I might be back tomorrow night talking about white folk and how they wildin', or I might not. So again, shout outs to those tuned in on IG. Shouts to those of you who are watching on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. As always, hit that subscribe button if you do find yourself viewing it. Hit the share button. I'm just about educating black folk, man, especially during this time where there's been a shift in community conversation when it comes to black folk and mental health. And I think it's important for black clinicians to recognize how we are perpetuating white supremacy every day of the week when we participate in this structure. We need to do the best that we can to minimize that harm that we're causing. And so what does that look like? What that looks like is not rushing to make a diagnosis, right? Not rushing to medicate an individual. Not diminishing the experiences of a community with whom you're not familiar. That's white supremacy-ish. We are better than that. And we need to hold ourselves accountable, right? Everything isn't depression. Everything isn't anxiety. Everything isn't bipolar. We're all trying to navigate this world the best way that we can. Yes, we have thoughts, feelings, and emotions that might not be conducive to our wellness. Yes, we've been going X direction and now we need to shift to go Y. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have white folk all up in our business. And so what I'm talking about is it might need to be more informal groups that's not related to insurance companies. We need to have other practices like meditation. Shout out to my sis Naima, her You vs. You book. Feel free to check her out on Instagram. We need other practices outside of medication. For many of us, talk therapy will be enough. Yes, that means we might have to have some sessions that are pro bono. I know we live in a world where don't ask me for my services unless you're going to cash me out. Because I have this dearth of experience. That's that white folk mentality. That's never been how we operated. And so, yes, do I want to be compensated? No doubt. But I also have to recognize that if black liberation and true healing is the goal, then we need to bring all our services to the center and let them guide us. All right, y'all, I'm out. Peace.